In what follows, I want to outline some of the most startling findings of the report before really tuning in on this idea of bureaucratically controlled death and how even this unspoken dream of policymakers and the euthanasia movement is a nightmare. And I want to finish with a warning about how issues like this highlight, perhaps more than any other, the importance of national sovereignty and maintaining decision making within countries, and why this is so important in matters of how we live and how we die. I should also note that my use of the word euthanasia makes a lot of advocates for this scream because they love to use soft phrasing to hide the reality of what they're doing. And I think Professor Ewell will talk about this in a bit more detail, but I should say briefly that I settled on this phrase euthanasia quite consciously after wading through intense terminological debate. Obviously, it's meant to have a positive connotation, literally meaning a good death in Greek, but it maintains the sordid history of that term that campaigners would like us to forget, a reminder of what supposed kindness and mercy became in the 20th century. And what we're talking about is active voluntary euthanasia, and I include assisted suicide under that umbrella. But as I'll show you, it's not always voluntary, and that was one of the most surprising things that I found while I was doing this research. So the report, titled "The Case Against Euthanasia in Europe, the Bureaucratic Control of Life and Death," released today, details a number of findings that shocked even me. The first was the degree of expansion. Even as I was doing this research, I came to an MCC event, and someone says, "Oh yeah, they've just passed it in Slovenia." It was just like the dominoes were falling right under our noses. And anyone who was against it was on the back foot. They didn't even realize it. Usually, the people that have the courage to stand up to these things, the few that are left, are religious groups. And I spoke to religious groups, and they had no idea. Of 27 member states, only 10 have taken a strong stance against euthanasia. But as John's pointed out, even they are currently hearing from very active campaigners. It's a worldwide strategy, and it's a foot in the door strategy. In every country, lobby groups start by promising highly restrictive laws. Only at the very end of life, they say. It's only to be used in cases of extreme suffering, they promise. They say this not because it's true, but because their actual vision is much more expansive and permissive than the public is willing to accept. David Seymour, leader of New Zealand's ACT Party, has admitted he agreed to restrictive measures only to get their euthanasia bill to pass. Since then, he and other advocates have campaigned doggedly for the removal of state safeguards under the banner of improving access. Canadians were promised a limited and rare euthanasia law. But once legalized, safeguards that were supposed to mean that this was just for the very most extreme cases of suffering fell one by one. And now Canada has one of the most, if not the most, permissive euthanasia laws in the world. Campaigners adopt this slow education process on purpose because they know that the public would not be with them if they told them the truth. For good reason. The historical legacy of euthanasia rightly causes most citizens to pause because the outcome that so often results is the one that they expressly wish to avoid. The next thing that surprised me was how much the claim that this is about autonomy and choice is a lie. I was always suspicious of the zealousness with which campaigners pursued euthanasia and the ease with which those in power took their side. It was about the holy virtue of autonomy, they said. But even I was surprised at how quickly the thin veneer of autonomy fell away. As a lover of freedom and autonomy and choice myself, I expected that this would be the most difficult argument to contest. But I very quickly realized that this was not about autonomy at all. Let me give you an example of this. I was on Times Radio recently reviewing the papers, as I do sometimes, and lo and behold, I had nothing to do with this. The first issue that comes up, euthanasia, or assisted dying as they like to call it. And the person that I was on with, there's always two people reviewing the paper, starts going on and on about the importance of autonomy. Let nothing take away our sacred right to autonomy and choice, he proclaimed. Oh, how we heard about the importance of autonomy. And then there was a commercial break, and we came back. And the next topic was unhealthy food and obesity. Oh my, where did that sacred virtue of autonomy and choice go? It was all but forgotten. Suddenly we all needed to be saved from ourselves, from the illusion of choice. For years, the commentariat and policymakers have dedicated themselves to the very task of questioning our capacity for autonomy. They talked of libertarian paternalism and nudge. They told us that new discoveries in neuroscience, so new and dazzling they scarcely understood them themselves, had placed the final nail in the coffin of the Enlightenment myth of rational man and his capacity for autonomous decision-making. And of course, throughout the pandemic, we saw firsthand how little governments and elites actually valued autonomy. So excuse me if I hear this sudden championing of autonomy and choice in the lone instance where citizens choose to die, if I'm a little bit skeptical. But I was surprised at the speed with which the mask slipped, how quickly the discussion slipped into burdens and costs of healthcare. And I think the bureaucratic control of death. And this is one of the more important points from the report, and the last one, or the second last one that I want to bring up here. That this is not about autonomy, as I said, but about a dream of bureaucratically controlling death. We've been here before. Death can be unpredictable. It can be costly. But like birth before it, subjecting it to a medical process can make it predictable. And above all, cheap. In Oregon, health insurance companies regularly ration access to expensive chemotherapy, but access to euthanasia is never rationed. Campaigners promise a painless, rationalized death overseen by the appropriate authorities. They swear that clandestine euthanasia is happening everywhere, and subjecting it to a bureaucratic process will make it safer. Actually, the opposite is true. With real choice comes responsibility. State-legalized euthanasia is a highly bureaucratized system. Judgments are handed over to a bureaucratic process so that responsibility is deflected and choice becomes a box-ticking exercise. The patient might be thinking, well, am I a candidate? Well, there's this panel of experts that will be telling me. I'll fill out this appropriately blandly titled form. Like it's called something in Canada, it's something like bland form C532. And you apply for your death. And there's a veneer of expertise. They will make a judgment. So the person says, am I a candidate? But what they don't realize is that the panel of experts is thinking, well, you are if you say you are. And the person is thinking, well, I am if you say I am. And so nobody actually is taking responsibility for this. An example of this, Christopher Lyon, whose father was killed in Canada, he feels he was fast-tracked for MAID after a life of suicidal, MAID is what they call it in Canada. He was fast-tracked for euthanasia after a life of suicidal ideation. He talks about how the assessor, after he begged the assessor, they had very little time before the euthanasia was supposed to take place, and he begs the assessor for a psychiatrist to review the case. And he's certain, once an expert looks at this, they will see my father's not really a candidate. And the assessor said to him, it'll just be a formality that will provide cover. Literally said that. It'll provide cover. And that's what bureaucracy becomes. Becomes a way of expressly avoiding responsibility. That is the banality of evil. And actually, as I was writing the report, it reminded me over and over of the trans issue. You have opaque claims making that wants a permissive system with few checks and balances, that it knows the public is not on board with, so it hides behind a much more palatable and agreeable claim. scary death, horrible death. You're going to have a horrible, painful death. Aren't you a good person? Aren't you a good person? Don't you have compassion? Then you should be on board with this. So they use this kind of emotional blackmail, and behind which they hide much more permissive claims. They don't actually want checks and balances, just like the trans activists didn't want checks and balances. They want a very permissive system. Are you trans? Well, you are if you say you are. Well, are you a candidate for euthanasia? You are if you say you are. And that's actually what winds up materializing in a lot of countries. The second thing that reminds me of the trans issue is the deflection of autonomy onto process. It's the exact same thing. Trans people often talk about how surprised they were that they were expecting these experts to tell them if they were really trans. But there were no experts. The process was a formality that deflected responsibility, and it's the same for this issue. We have zealous campaigners who manage to gain ownership of the issue and its oversight. In many countries, the people who are assessing whether or not deaths were followed the law are euthanasia advocates. There's very, very little oversight. They have managed to capture the entire process. And they also, for instance, the Canadian Association of Maid Providers has been accused of coaching people what to say in assessments to get approved for euthanasia. And this has happened also in the trans issue. So I find these parallels very interesting, but it's a warning of what happens when very zealous advocates manage to capture an issue almost entirely. And it tells us how important it is to stand up against these things. To be brave, to not fall for emotional blackmail about forcing people to suffer. Do you want people to suffer? No, you have to stand up against these things, because the worst thing is when we allow complete control of activists over something as important as life and death. And finally, even the dream of bureaucratically controlled death is misguided. The experience from around the world where legalization of euthanasia has proceeded shows us that bureaucracy often fails, leaving the details surrounding many euthanasia deaths opaque. For instance, some Canadian provinces record the cause of death as the underlying medical condition, not euthanasia. Euthanasia deaths are usually not investigated in the same way as other suicides, and punishment for non-compliance with regulations is rare. For instance, a 2010 study found that 1.8% of responding physicians in Belgium, where you all agree with this apparently, admitted to carrying out euthanasia procedures without the explicit consent of the patient. So I was quite surprised that non-voluntary euthanasia is happening. In Canada and Washington state, for instance, legally mandated safeguards are known not to be met in a percentage of cases, but no practitioner has ever been prosecuted. The system in Victoria, Australia, for instance, has been described as hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. In other words, it appears designed for the regulator to find out nothing, investigate nothing, and report nothing that could suggest that assisted dying has been anything other than an unblemished success. When suicide and killing are stripped of their stigma through a bureaucratic process, another theme that I describe in the report, we risk losing one of the key potentials bequeathed to us by the birth of a secular society, the possibility that human life, its comfort and its extension, might be our guiding moral compass. The ease with which human life has become expendable speaks to the possibility that we may at last be losing this. Movements to legalize euthanasia are not an isolated development, but the culmination of much deeper trends through which the value of human life has been systematically eroded. And this is one of the most important reasons why it must be opposed. But the ways in which it can be opposed, usually at the national level, are also being systematically eroded. Lobbyists are trying to legalize euthanasia through a variety of means across Europe. First, through a domino effect, thinking that if they target weaker countries where they see political opportunities, then they use success in that country to push neighboring countries to follow suit, like it's this progressive turn that populations are turning toward this. And they also are seeking changes at the level of human rights. So everyone who is a signatory to the Convention on Human Rights will have to follow suit. This must never happen, ironically, because it would be one of the biggest threats to human rights. One of the main safeguards against this happening is the different cultural social, economic, health systems across Europe. And this makes it very, very unlikely, thank God, that you'll have a top-down euthanasia law, but it's not impossible. And any steps toward cascading legalization of euthanasia across the European continent are significant moves toward the EU's bureaucratic control of death. For that reason, they must be opposed. We have to keep the door shut.